There is a kind of silence that only appears at Christmas. In Oak Valley, this silence was accompanied by something more. Not from a scream or an alarm. Just the strange feeling that, in that beautiful snow, not everyone would return home. I always wait all year for Christmas to arrive. Not in an anxious way. It's more like someone waiting for shelter. I can't say if it's because of the lights, the streets transformed into shimmering corridors, or that white silence that the snow brings when it falls slowly, as if trying to calm the world before something important happens. Perhaps it's just an old habit, a fond memory I cling to when the year starts to weigh too heavily on my shoulders. But somehow, whenever December arrives, something inside me ignites. It's as if I remembered who I was before things got tough. The whole city changes. The rooftops wake up covered in a thin layer of freshly fallen snow, glistening beneath the yellowed lampposts, as if someone had sprinkled light over everything. The sidewalks are filled with decorated pine trees, each carrying the story of a different family. Through the windows I see handmade garlands, red candles, small nativity scenes carefully assembled, and golden ribbons hanging from doors that seem to smile back at passers-by. The air smells of hot chocolate, cinnamon, and damp wood. It's a strange mix, but one that always takes me straight back to my childhood, to a time when winter didn't frighten us. It only protected us. People walk more slowly through the streets, as if time has decided to give them a break. They carry bags full of gifts, colorful boxes adorned with ribbons, and cookies wrapped in cellophane. The children run around the central square with gloves that are too big for their small hands, fall in the snow, get up, laugh loudly, leaving crooked marks on the ground. Every now and then, someone passes by pushing an improvised sled, one of those that become a toy storage container when they get home. Everything seems in its place. And perhaps that's exactly why nobody notices when something starts to go wrong. And while all of this is common in any small town at this time of year, there's something about Oak Valley, something in the way the snow falls, in the way the houses light up, that makes everything more intimate. Not just beautiful, but close. As if each street had been decorated by someone who truly believed that Christmas is still synonymous with hope, and not just a habit. My street, in particular, looked like it came straight out of an old postcard. Low houses, wood aged by time, chimneys smoking at dawn, releasing thin columns of smoke that mingled with the snow. People greeted each other familiarly, as if they had known each other for decades. They would exchange jars of homemade jam, compare recipes, and silently compete to see who had the best decorated tree. Even those who didn't have much money made a point of hanging at least one small light on their balcony. It was almost an unwritten rule. Nobody went through the month of December without decorating something, even if it was just to show that it was still there. That week, the city was practically ready for Christmas dinner. You could feel in the air that strange mix of anxiety and comfort that only exists at this time of year. Tables being set, roasts being prepared early in the morning, children rehearsing Christmas carols in garages, adults trying to hide presents behind doors that never closed properly. Everything was happening at the same time, in every house, as if Oak Valley were breathing in unison. And in the midst of all this, I walked down the street with my hands buried in my coat pockets, observing every detail with that familiar feeling of being part of something bigger. It felt like belonging. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing was out of sync. Nothing threatened to shatter that perfect bubble of winter, lights, and expectation that enveloped the entire city. It was just another Christmas, or at least, that's what everyone believed. And perhaps that's exactly why nobody paid much attention when, one afternoon in the middle of that almost perfect December, the first reports of disappearances started appearing. There were no sensational headlines, nothing that interrupted the music in the square or turned off the newly installed lights. Just brief notes, side comments, information delivered almost as a footnote, too careful not to break the spell that Oak Valley seemed so determined to preserve. A reporter from the local newspaper mentioned that 2 people had not returned from a ski trail. On the radio, Someone briefly mentioned a young man who went out to buy ingredients for Christmas dinner and never returned. On television, during the weather forecast, a small caption appeared warning that patrols are being sent to the city's outer areas due to reports of disappearances. It was presented in such a neutral, polished way that it almost seemed intentional, as if the news program itself didn't have the courage to spoil the Christmas spirit. Nobody panicked. No one stopped decorating their houses. No one canceled parties or religious services. The most frequently repeated explanation was always the same. The cold is treacherous. People drink too much. It's a busy time of year. People disappear and reappear all the time. I thought so too. Almost everyone thought that way. The city continued its bright rhythm. The children continued rehearsing songs, and the residents continued buying panettone and hanging red stockings in their windows. Until that particular morning. I was leaving home to buy hot chocolate when I noticed something unusual on my neighbor's balcony to the left. A gift. A small, square gift, discreetly wrapped in white paper with a dark red ribbon, one of those thick satin ones, perfectly ornamented. It was just one of the thousands of gifts scattered around the city at that time. I went on my way, because there was no reason to think about anything beyond the obvious. Someone to leave. It was an early gift. Perhaps for his wife. Perhaps for one of their children whom they used to visit during the holidays. It wasn't uncommon. In fact, on that street, in recent days, residents had adopted the habit of leaving packages on their balconies as small gestures of kindness. But that same afternoon, when I returned, I found the street restless. The police car was parked right in front of my neighbor's house. People were whispering on the sidewalk, forming an uncomfortable semicircle. Everyone was looking at the open door, but no one dared to go in. Some were shivering, and I noticed it wasn't because of the cold. Only then did I hear the snide comment from a woman who lived at the end of the street. As far as I understand, these are body parts belonging to one of the missing people. A knot formed in my stomach. I felt nauseous. An icy chill ran down my spine as I tried to understand what I had heard. I stood there, trying to piece things together, but they simply wouldn't fit. People spoke softly, as if the very air could hear them. I tried listening more, but no one clearly stated what was inside the package. They would just repeat it, almost always with a choked voice. It wasn't an ordinary gift. Call the police chief. This cannot be, is happening here. And while the whole street writhed in fear, I realized that, despite never having touched the package, despite never even having come close to it, that image, the white wrapping, the dark red ribbon, had imprinted something deep in my mind. Over the next 3 days, the entire city seemed to unite even more in a single purpose, that of fear. There have been no new disappearances. There were no new gifts. But there was silence. A silence that, in a city that used to live as if it were inside a Christmas postcard, was almost an aggression. The police arrived very early, even before the sun had fully risen. I saw the vehicles speeding down the snow-covered street, their lights reflecting off the snowflakes like tiny red and blue sparks. Investigators went door to door, knocked on houses, asked for statements, and gathered any rumors that they could turn into clues. Part of the investigation focused on the missing, people who had vanished in the preceding days while skiing, sightseeing, gathering firewood, or simply going out to see the city lights. But the other part, the police officers whispered, as if saying it was in bad taste or dangerous. To whom did the part found inside that gift belong? Nobody knew. And this lack of response only amplified the theories. The city was divided. There were those who laughed at the situation, calling it all a bad teenage prank, a kind of morbid joke. I overheard some people at the grocery store saying that it must just be pork, left there by someone trying to get attention. Others swore it was indeed human, that the police had secretly confirmed they were withholding information so as not to spoil Christmas. Others, especially the older ones, whispered a theory that managed to be even worse because it offered no logical culprit. They said that was a harvest. an ancient type of ritual predating even the Christian Christmas itself. A tribute to winter, according to a woman who spoke too softly, fidgeting with her rosary beads with trembling fingers. She said that, before any Christmas figures, there were entities linked to snow, cold, and silence, and that some legends said they took away the weakest, the most disobedient, or simply those who were in their way. I didn't know whether I was more scared by the gifts or by the theories. During those 3 days, no one else received anything strange, but that didn't bring any comfort. On the contrary, it was as if the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen again. The Christmas lights continued to shine. No one dared to turn them off. The music continued to play in the streets, albeit at a lower volume. The children were still playing, but closer to the doors, always under the watchful eye of their parents. Because despite everything, nobody canceled Christmas. It seemed like a kind of collective stubbornness, an invisible pact that asked us to pretend everything was all right, to keep the tradition alive, to continue with the festivities, as if the Christmas spirit were strong enough to repel any shadow that might be lurking in the city. But the joy was different. Almost everyone looked over their shoulder as they walked. Almost everyone locked their doors before sunset. Almost everyone murmured the same phrase, repeated like a nervous prayer. If he didn't show up yesterday, maybe he won't show up again. But nobody seemed very convinced of that, and I couldn't tell if I was afraid of the gift that had appeared, or of the silence of those who might still be to come. In the early hours of the 4th day, the city, which had already been living in a fragile balance between fear and the stubborn insistence on keeping Christmas alive, simply awoke differently. I found out on television, even before I had coffee. The presenter tried to maintain a journalistic demeanor, but his voice trembled. There was something in his eyes, as if even he was having difficulty believing what he was reading on the teleprompter. 6 young people had disappeared during the early morning hours. 6. All at once. The entire city collapsed. From the fragmented accounts that emerged throughout the morning, all of them, young men and women between 17, in their early 20s, they had left home secretly, in groups of 2 or 3, a few minutes after midnight. Each group had a different destination: a late-night movie session, a stroll through the illuminated streets, a visit to the oldest parts of the city, where the accumulated snow transformed everything into an almost magical scene. But the truth, as their own friends began to comment, was different. They wanted to find the person responsible for the gifts. Young people are like that. They believe that courage is enough to face monsters, even when they don't know if the monster is human. From the moment this became clear, panic gripped the city like a silent wildfire. The hours became a countdown. The parents of each of them rushed to the police when they noticed in the morning that the beds were too neatly made, that the phones were switched off, and that the social media accounts were silent. The despair began in isolation. A mother believed her son was with friends. A father thought his daughter had slept at someone's house. A grandmother said her grandson must have overslept. But despair soon becomes collective. All it took was a crossed connection, a comment uttered through tears, a name repeated for the 2nd time. Did your son also go out last night? Were they together? My God, there were 6. And then came the phrase that froze the entire city. More than 8 hours have passed. This is not normal. From that point on, time stopped moving at its usual pace. The hours dragged on as if they were made of ice. Families gathered in front of the police station. Some cried, others screamed, some simply stared at the ground. The police, realizing the seriousness of the situation, immediately convened a task force. Patrol cars were sent to all known spots where teenagers used to gather: the lookout point, the frozen lake, the old railway tunnel, the shopping areas decorated with lights. Even the most remote regions, where snow had accumulated in dangerous layers, were searched. Nothing. No clues. No trace. No sign of a struggle. No fresh footprints. It was as if the 6 young people had been erased from the city map, snatched away in the early hours of the morning without the world noticing. And then, as the hours passed, 9, 10, 11 hours since the disappearance, a silent thought began to haunt everyone's mind. No one said it aloud, but it was impossible to ignore. If someone were keeping the young people alive, the window of opportunity was closing. Everyone knows there's a cruel limit to the statistics on kidnapping and disappearances. After a certain point, the probability of finding someone alive plummets. And we were already beyond that point. Nobody was prepared for another gift. Nobody wanted to even imagine that possibility. But she hung in the air like smoke. If no one has found them yet, would anyone find them first? Everyone knows there's a cruel limit to the statistics on kidnapping and disappearances. After a certain point, the probability of finding someone alive plummets. And we were already beyond that point. Nobody was prepared for another gift. Nobody wanted to even imagine that possibility. But she hung in the air like smoke. If no one has found them yet, would anyone find them first? The tension was so palpable it seemed to accompany the breathing of every adult in the city. The Christmas decorations continued to shine, but the shine seemed crooked, out of place, almost offensive. The snow continued to fall slowly, covering the streets with the same gentleness as always, but now it sounded like a complicit silence. And as I walked around the block trying to understand what was happening, I noticed that everyone was avoiding eye contact, because it was difficult to admit what everyone was thinking. If the last victims were random people, who could guarantee that this time the gift wouldn't have a known name? 3 days after the disappearance of the 6 young people, the city woke up, without having slept. It was strange. No one had slept a wink, but everyone had the feeling that they had stayed up all night out of obligation, not because of insomnia, as if something greater had demanded vigilance, as if the silence of the entire night had not allowed for rest. And yet, when the pale morning light finally pierced through the accumulated snow, the houses seemed even darker than before. It was only when the sun touched the rooftops that the shouts began. One here, another one over there, and soon, the whole city seemed to breathe the same horror. The families of the missing young people had received gifts, no gifts whatsoever. The same simple boxes, covered in light-colored paper, adorned with a dark red ribbon, exactly the same type the city already knew. Except that this time, it wasn't just rumors or assumptions whispered around a campfire. It was real, and they were on the doors of families who had lost their children. The parents were the first to see it, and their falls, each reacting in their own way. One collapsed in the snow, another recoiled as if shot. A mother stood motionless, as if time had broken around her. That's what alerted the entire neighborhood. They didn't touch the boxes. Nobody touched it, but everyone knew what was inside. The sound of calls to the police echoed through the streets. Phones vibrating, people running, despair mixed with the snow and the icy morning air. It was impossible not to notice. The simultaneous delivery meant that none of those young men were alive anymore. The police arrived quickly, but not quickly enough to stop the terror from spreading. They cordoned off the houses, put up yellow tape, and asked everyone to stay away. But how could you keep someone away from a gift that might contain what was left of their own son? Hours later, the television station interrupted its Christmas programming with the official announcement. The police chief, pale as the snow outside, read the words with almost surgical precision. Preliminary analyses confirm that the contents found inside the boxes belong to the missing youths. Fragments of human tissue. Total genetic compatibility. We are dealing, until further notice, with a serial killer. The phrase landed like a punch in the gut for the city. Serial killer. On Christmas Eve. And worse, someone who enjoyed toying with their targets. Journalists began arguing live on air. Social media exploded. Families were evacuated indoors, cared for by professionals who were clearly unprepared for that scene. Christmas was dawning, but there was something about it that didn't belong on this date. It was the wrong dawn. The police issued new recommendations, now read with a sense of urgency that left no doubt about what they were facing. No one should go out alone. No one should be walking around the city outside of business hours. No one should answer the door without confirming who was on the other side. Doors and windows locked at all times. To always let friends and family know when going out. Never, under any circumstances, ignore a shout or noise coming from the street, the investigators kept repeating. He approaches those who are alone. What nobody said, but everyone thought, was much worse. 6 young people had gone out together, and yet they disappeared. The feeling that gripped the city was not just fear. It was a kind of ancestral helplessness, as if something were watching every window lit by Christmas decorations. The days following the discovery of the gifts seemed to drag the city into a place where Christmas no longer belonged. The lights remained on, stubborn, bright, almost offensive in the face of horror. But no one saw them the same way anymore. There was fear behind every lit window, a feeling that something was approaching, slowly and inevitably. That's when the police called an extraordinary press conference. I watched it on television, with my coffee cup stopping halfway to my mouth, never quite making it there. The town hall was packed. There was tension in the seats, in the heavy coats, in the tired eyes. It was as if the whole city was gathered there, even those who couldn't physically attend. The detective in charge of the investigation entered with the face of someone who hadn't slept, and perhaps it wasn't just tiredness. He was carrying a thick, very old briefcase, yellowed at the edges. And even before he spoke, I sensed that this object did not belong to our time. He placed the folder on the lectern and took a deep breath. After analyzing the fragments found and comparing them with historical records, we found a pattern. The word standard seemed to push the air out of the room. The detective continued. These crimes, in which victims disappear and body parts are delivered in boxes, are not unprecedented. The city has experienced this before. It was a strange and impossible statement. But he opened the folder, revealing documents that appeared to be over a century old. The earliest records date back to 1879, when the city was still an isolated colony, surrounded by dense forests and harsh winters. That year, at the very beginning of December, 5 residents disappeared, without a trace, without explanation. He turned another page, but he opened the folder, revealing documents that appeared to be over a century old. The earliest records date back to 1879, when the city was still an isolated colony, surrounded by dense forests and harsh winters. That year, at the very beginning of December, 5 residents disappeared, without a trace, without explanation. He turned another page. On December 25th of that year, body parts were found inside simple boxes, wrapped with red ribbons. A shock was felt in the room. I myself had to look away for a moment. The records described the victims' injuries, precise, deep, symmetrical cuts, the same ones we are now finding on the missing young people. It was like hearing an echo from another century. But the detective didn't stop. The second cycle occurred in 1904, 25 years later, same time of year, approximately the same number of missing persons, same delivery, same signature. He listed the following cycles, as if he were reading the calendar of a ritual: 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, and then he announced what no one wanted to hear. We are in exactly the year in which the pattern should occur again. The entire room seemed to shrink. In each cycle, he continued, the disappearances began suddenly and ended on December 25th, always at Christmas, always without explanation. They never found the culprit. There were never any witnesses. There were never any survivors. The television cameras zoomed in on his face. It was impossible to ignore the slight tremor in his voice. Old folk accounts called this event the Winter Reaper, a phenomenon that the colonists described as inevitable. Something that came with the longest snowstorms. Something that required young blood to appease the winter. He made air quotes, making it clear that he didn't believe it, but also making it clear that he didn't know what to believe. This is not a myth. This is historical, documented. People in the room began to murmur. Some prayed, some cried. Others stared at the detective with the desperate disbelief of those who know reality is crumbling but don't want to admit it. And then, as if that were the worst part, he added, "In every cycle, one of the victims belonged to this very block." I felt my breath catch in my chest. It was as if something had turned to look directly at my street. The detective closed the folder slowly, with an almost ceremonial gesture, as if sealing something that should never have been opened. We don't know if we're dealing with an imitator or with something we're following without understanding, but the pattern repeats itself, and it's active again. The press conference ended, but it didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like something foreshadowed, as if, by opening that folder, the detective had unlocked the past, and as if the past were coming back seeking continuity. That night, while the Christmas lights were shining outside, I had the impression that something was walking along the street. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something invisible to the eye, impossible to detect, since no footprints were ever found, and mysterious. I never truly believed the standard could reach my door. It was too ridiculous. Even though everything pointed to it, even though all the old records mentioned that there was always a victim in my neighborhood, I convinced myself that it would be different. After all, there were countless other people on this same block. But on Christmas Eve, I realized that the whole city seemed to be breathing in a strange way. The snowstorm wasn't just falling, it was plummeting. Thick, heavy, as if something were forcefully pushing the snow from above. The wind wasn't blowing. It was roaring against the windows, making them tremble as if they were about to burst. And the lights seemed to pulse like a sick heart. It was shortly after 10 o'clock at night that I realized something was wrong inside my own house. First, it was a snap. Dry, coming from the ceiling. I froze, still sitting on the sofa, with the room lit only by half of the Christmas lights, because the other half had suddenly gone out. The cracking sound repeated itself. Then it turned into a step. This is it. Heavy. The attic. My whole body stiffened as if I had been electrocuted. I tried to convince myself that it was the wood creaking from the cold. But then came the second step, then the third. And no snap in the world has that kind of impact. I stood up slowly, as if any sudden movement might attract the attention of whatever was up there. But it was useless. The noise descended, passing through the ceiling as if it were following me with its ear pressed to the floor. My heart was beating so fast I could feel the rhythm in my eyes. My breathing was catching. My throat was dry. Then, suddenly, the noise stopped. For a second, there was absolute silence. Heavy. Paralyzing. Then came the sound that took my breath away. Footsteps in the basement. First on the ceiling, then on the ground. It was as if something had passed through the entire house in a matter of seconds. And now it was going up. I ran to the front door and pulled the doorknob hard. Nothing. She didn't move. It was unlocked. I had unlocked it myself, but it was as if someone was holding the door from the outside. The power went out at that instant. The house was plunged into utter darkness. And it was there, in that first second of darkness, that I realized I was no longer alone. I felt, before I heard, the presence in the hallway. Free. Heavy. It was as if the air had become denser at that specific point. My chest tightened so much that I had to put my hand on the wall to keep from falling. I tried to speak, but the voice didn't come out. I tried to scream, but it was as if a pillow had been pressed against my mouth, muffling everything. The wind howled outside, and for a moment, I heard windows being hurled against their frames. The whole house was creaking as if it were being tortured from the inside. I stepped back down the hallway, feeling my way along the wall, tripping over my own feet. But the more I ran, the house seemed endless. The rooms I had known since childhood seemed distorted, elongated, too dark. It's as if someone had pulled the walls away from each other. I wasn't sure anymore if I was going to the kitchen, or to the bedroom, or nowhere at all. That's when I heard. No steps. I don't drag it. But breathing. Strong, wet, slow. It felt like something enormous was exhaling onto the back of my neck. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked in pure, irrational terror. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it was echoing throughout the whole house. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see it. But some wretched part within me, some remnant of human curiosity that should have vanished with the first disappearances, compelled me. I will come. And there was nothing. Nothing that my eyes could comprehend. Only solidified darkness, as if the shadow had weight, as if she were about to move. I stumbled back, trying to escape, trying to open windows that wouldn't respond, trying to turn on the phone that remained dead as if it had been drained. I screamed. I screamed until my throat burned, but nobody listened. The street was completely lit up, completely alive. But it was as if my house no longer existed for the rest of the world. It's as if I've been torn from the city and placed somewhere else, a place where the cycle came to retrieve what was missing. I heard the first footstep behind me, and I felt it, with a certainty so profound it hurt. That night did not belong to the living, and that the Reaper was no longer counting old victims. I was telling my story. I tried to run. I don't remember how many doors I opened, how many times I tripped, how many times I bumped my shoulder against walls that seemed to move. But running made no difference. The whole house was a living labyrinth, folding in on itself, spinning as if each room were running away from me or pushing me where I didn't want to go. When I first saw it, I didn't understand what I was seeing. He wasn't a man. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't an animal. It was something in between. A distorted, humanoid blur, as if mist worms were stirring its outline. Each time I tried to focus on him, the image rippled as if the air around him was being burned and reconstructed at the same time. He couldn't walk. He was sliding. I recoiled so quickly that I slipped on the floor. That's when I realized my hands were red. My whole arm throbbed. There were cuts I didn't remember getting. Symmetrical, precise cuts, like the ones the detective had described. The ritual had already begun before I even saw it. The thing moved its head toward me, or at least it seemed to move, because I couldn't see a face, eyes, nothing that could belong to a living body. Just a dark blur that pulsed like smoke-holding shape. I tried to stand up, but my legs trembled as if they were made of brittle ice. And before I could take the first step, the whole house fell into a darkness so deep, it seemed like liquid. When the power came back on, I was no longer in my room. I was at the center of the ritual. The ground was snow tinged with something dark, almost black. The air was warm, as if breathing fire and ice at the same time. And all around me was a gigantic pentagram etched in the snow, shining with a light that didn't come from any candle. But there were candles, 5, one at each end, and they were all burning without wind. They were all dripping with red wax. I tried to move my arms and immediately felt I was imprisoned. Strings, wires, hands, I don't know. I only know that something was squeezing my wrists, my ankles, my waist. Something that vibrated, as if it were alive. The thing, the Reaper, was right beside me, and now I could see a little more. There was meat. There were bones. There was something that looked like an exposed spinal column, but it was moving as if it were breathing on its own. The blur lowered, moving closer to my chest. I felt the first cut before I understood what was happening. It wasn't like a knife cut. It was as if the air had been sharpened. An invisible blade slid across my chest with a precision that was almost ritualistic, symmetrical, deep. My scream came out muffled, swallowed by the blizzard itself, or by the pentagram. I don't know. Another cut. Deeper. Now on the side of the chest. I felt the blood running hot, boiling against the cold of the night. With each cut, candles flickered around me, as if absorbing the sound of my pain. My heart was racing so fast it hurt. It looked like it wanted to jump out before someone could pull it away. The creature, the blur, placed its hand on my chest. An impossible hand, with fingers that were too long, too bony, too deformed. I felt the pressure. And for a moment, I had the impression that everything inside me was moving. It felt like my organs were trying to drift apart, as if even they understood what was about to happen. The ropes tightened, the pentagram glowed, the sails rose higher, and I understood. It was always like that. Always the same ritual, always the same night. It's always the same victim missing to complete the cycle. The creature tilted its head as if studying me, as if he expected me to accept the fate that others before me had accepted, or had no way to avoid. She spread her fingers across my chest. The skin opened along with it, as if obeying. I felt the tear. I felt the heat. I felt the hand enter, slow, steady, searching. The whole world was spinning. The snow was disappearing. The candles disappeared. Even the air seemed to disappear. All that remained was that deep, invasive, inevitable touch. And then, the creature found what it wanted. I felt fingers touch my heart. Inexplicable. The agonizing pain rose in my throat like a scream that never came out. If you want new stories for your late nights, you know where to find me.